the average person in the street, what Torah does he study? But again, even when we say the average person doesn't study, person is a great Torah sage, and he has to have that level of clarity we understand. He should be more careful. But the ordinary person who knows close to nothing doesn't really make a difference. So it's a provision. If the only reason is because of what the damage you bring about, there's not much loss. The man doesn't study. But what about prayer? Just as one speech is compromised in regard to Torah, because Torah has to be verbalized and articulated, if one prays only through meditation and does not actually verbalize and articulate the words, it's not valid. If, according to Rambam, one has a Torah obligation to pray once in 24 hours. Rabbinically, another two times. Evening, morning, and afternoon. If one does not word those words, verbalize those words, you do not fulfill your obligation of prayer. Everything comes through verbal expression. So if one's verbal expression is actually damaged, tainted, your tefillah. If we have no tefillah, we can't, our supplications fall on deaf ears because they're not appropriate. So what we've given up. So even the ordinary person who's not invested in Torah, so he's not giving up much. But you know, it's interesting. The Gemara tells us in Brachos that a woman is absolved from any mitzvah which is time determined. So the Gemara says, is a woman obligated in the Amidah to pray? Because again, it's limited to time. You pray in the morning, you pray in the afternoons, it's time determined. So the Talmud answers, you mean to say women don't need mercy? They don't need God's mercy? And since tefillah is what actually is the vehicle to activate and to draw God's mercy, so although it's dictated by time, a woman prays. A woman has an obligation to say the Amidah. So we see without that you can't survive. Because the Gemara says, Noshim, Rachmin boy, even women need mercy. Everybody needs mercy. So if the key to mercy, to activate that mercy, is prayer, and prayer is only through verbalization, articulation, and we've damaged that, so what are we left with? So even as we say, there's always whispering in our ears by what we call by the evil inclination. He's always convincing us it's okay. It's not so terrible. But if the key to life is the tefillah, and even that you've given out, you've thrown away the key, then what are you left with? You're helpless. You're helpless, and therefore you're hopeless. Therefore, the only way we're able to get back on track, as we used to say, you got to clean up your act. How do you clean up your act? You have to clean house. You have to start looking ourselves in the mirror and saying and reflecting, we're pretty good people, but if you still could be better and fixed what's broken, and there's a lot broken, a lot is damaged, a lot needs refurbishing, has to be revitalized. Person has a home. After so many years, you have to weatherize it. You have to refurbish it. You have to paint it. A human being with a short period of time, unless you focus, you begin deteriorating. There's plenty of slippage. The Gemara tells us brachos, divrei Torah tzrichin chizuk. Torah needs tremendous amount of upshoring. Because any level of loss of focus, immediately, there's a certain level of regression. We regress immediately. Could you imagine flying in a F-23 and he sets the panel, the mechanisms on it, so it's automatic pilot, but it goes only certain, and all of a sudden he gets involved in some kind of inane conversation, which really he should be focused on the panel. And the conversation carries on too long. What does he end up? That he'll never land that plane. Unless you focus on what you say, it's inevitable. You're going to damage it. You're going to damage that speech. We're going to actually compromise our spiritual standing. You always have to be You know, in any field, whether it's law, whether it's in medicine, you have to be always up on your game. There's always new things coming out. You have to read. Person is an accountant. There's always new tax codes coming out. You have to be up on your game. If you're not up on your game, it's irrelevant what was last week, what was last year. You always have to be well read, and you have to take courses always to be that expert in whatever field you're in. To be an expert Jew, to be a proper Jew, an appropriate Jew, you have to study and you have to review and you have to reflect and you have to discuss whatever that text is. You know, King Solomon says 2 heads are better than one. 2 people are better than one. Because if one person falls, the other person can help him up. If you're all by yourself, you fall, who's going to pull you up? Asay locha, kedei locha chover. We read in Pirkei Avos. Asay locha rav uknei locha chover. You should purchase. That doesn't mean acquire a friend. Acquisitions always, there's a cost factor. A friend will tell you what you don't want to hear, but you have to hear it. Because everybody said we're not perfect. We always have blind spots. And if you have that good friend, not tells you what you want to hear, it's necessarily what you don't want to hear, but you have to hear it, then you're going to make the corrections. But if you don't have the friend, or you're within a certain social group where they all don't begin understanding what it's all about, and nobody even recognizes and understands, and they see this as positive rather than negative, then that person has a problem. Of course, he's going to deteriorate to a level. It's like, a person's in an old age home. Everybody has their arthritis, everybody has the aches and pains. So what do they talk about? They all have aches and pains. So what do they know? But if a person is of the same age and he doesn't understand, he says, why? Why don't you? He says, don't you realize? Because you're not living a responsible lifestyle. If you live more responsibly and you're still at a point, you can really correct it. If you'd exercise, you're more healthy, go out and get fresh air and whatever it is, maybe your health will regenerate and you'll be better off and you won't have the pains any longer. If you have somebody to tell you when you fail, there's always, we could talk about correction. But if you're in a milieu, in a setting where nobody recognizes it, where do you go? You go south. And that's it. And everybody's going south. The whole world is going south. And that's why we find such a breakdown of society. Because nobody gets it. It's the blind leading the blind. Literally the blind leading the blind. What's leadership? Leadership has an understanding of values, morals, ethics, hardcore values, which is the foundation for society. Listen, Rome was the greatest power. They reigned the world for 500 years. But because there was a breakdown in society, they disappeared. Rome. They collapsed. Because they were barbarians. And they went from bad to worse until they self-destruct. They self-destructed. Same thing. For Judaism to wane and to eventually evaporate doesn't take very long. Doesn't take long. You have to pick your environment. Years ago when a person would move, he would always check where he buys his house, how close is it to the nearest synagogue? Is it within walking distance? If it's not within walking distance, it's irrelevant how good the purchase would be. If the person was a committed Jew, didn't have to be a great tzaddik, he would not go there. Because he understood if he can't go to shul with his children and have that level of influence in his life, then he's going to be very seriously compromised. And ultimately, within a short period of time, well, I'm going to have, we're going to sing and we'll pray together in the house. And what happens if you don't, and the kids don't have the environment and aren't encouraged, and they don't have friends, whatever it is? Therefore, that is the first and foremost. First we have to find is within walking distance of the synagogue. That's how key and crucial it is. Identically, to be associated with good people, as the Mesilas Yesharim writes, Rabbi Luzzatto writes, Chevra, one social circle is key to where you stand spiritually. If it's encouraging and people have an understanding, then you're in a better place. If they don't have an understanding and you're the lone man, the only choice you have is really you have to separate from them, because ultimately you're going to be influenced. That's the reality of life. So we find Yaakov, the most perfect of the patriarchs, the man who fathered the 12 tribes, the Jewish people. What was he concerned about? The most extreme level of transgression. But he understood if he has that pristine speech, the Torah will protect him, and he will merit that clarity. And despite living in a snake pit, he's not going to be bitten. The hissing of those venomous snakes are not going to affect him whatsoever. You know, you read a little bit about snakes. When a snake starts hissing, you know, I read an article about the cobra. The cobra, before it actually attacks its victim, it starts like doing like a little bit of a movements. It does horizontal and the cobra mesmerizes its victim. Before it attacks, it's like he puts the victim into a trance, where the victim loses sight of the danger that's about to happen, and the victim can't flee. And then after, the cobra has a perfect, it doesn't bite, shoots its venom in the person's eye. And when that venom goes in the eye, it paralyzes the person. First, you know, you give it a little bit of sedation, then you give the full anesthesia. And then then it bites the person, and it kills the person. It's identically the same thing. You get mesmerized. You go into a trance. The Rambam in Hilchos Tshuva writes in Hilchos Shofar, the laws regarding blowing the shofar on Rosh Hashanah, he says, although it's a divine obligation, but there's a subtle message that when we hear the shofar, there's a subtle message which is communicated to every Jew. And what is it? Those who are sleeping should awaken, and those who are in a trance should awaken from their trance. Hakitzimi tardamaschem. Tardemo is a trance. Awaken from your trance. And don't be totally subsumed with the vanities of life. Recognize your Creator. Make amends. Do the right thing. Don't waste your life. That is the wake-up call of the shofar. The shofar has an innate value. We're talking about this specifically on Rosh Hashanah. It has that spiritual edge to it, that every Jew, has the capacity to be touched spiritually. And when you're touched spiritually, it awakens certain feelings in you, which has to do with our conscience as a Jew, to focus on what's primary and what's secondary. That's what it is. Otherwise, we're susceptible as everyone is susceptible.